right, all right, all right. Some people may have got that. Yeah, that's what we're doing.
Yeah,
it is psychedelic. It is psychedelic week after all. Dazed and confused for some of you that haven't seen the movie.
Yeah, one of Matthew McConaughey's all-time great roles.
Right, and one of his first roles.
Right.
Well, it's psychedelic week, and we've got a good one. We're going to get into the mystical and pretend like everyone else on the planet that we know something about it.
Well, we've had some experiences we can talk about and describe.
Yeah.
That's something that we do know. We do know we've had experiences.
Oh, yeah. We've had experiences in all the stuff that we're going to talk about.
Well, let's talk about what the term mystical experience means for the purpose of this podcast. What are we talking about here?
It's far. it's far out.
It's far out. I mean, for me,
I guess. Yeah, go ahead.
I could just start and say that the phrase mystical experience was something I'd never heard of before until I was in college and I took an advanced religious studies course at Penn that was a survey of the mystics who had been burned at the stake or crucified and so on in the Middle Ages. And so what I got a lot of really interesting knowledge from that course, but I walked away with this notion that a mystical experience is a direct experience of divinity or something much bigger than ourselves, with no priest, no rabbi, no guide filtering, explaining, there's no middleman in a mystical experience. So that's my current understanding, is having a direct experience of something much bigger than us.
Yeah, I think mystical, I mean, we could get very technical from like a definition, but I would say it's definitely usually transcendent, something outside the ordinary perceptions of ego, into the non-ordinary perception of reality. Typically, it's beyond ego, although it doesn't have to be. Ego can be online. It can include the essence of reality, like divinity, or could be about getting in touch with essence of reality or the fabric of reality. But not all mystical experiences are about that either, right? So it's, I think it is something that's, tends to be a radical departure from our ordinary experience and tends to involve something that transcends ego. And there's many different areas we're going to talk about today in the mystical, and different elements and things. So
doesn't need to be a psychedelic.
Exactly.
Most of them aren't.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Many are spontaneous occurrences, near-death experiences. There's plenty of writings you can go and accepts of people having these experiences throughout history.
Mysticism exists in almost every religion. There's mystical branches in all religion. And it is something about having a direct experience of, usually in religion, it's of God, but of divinity. But I think it's just having a direct experience of, more that meets the eye, so to speak.
Right.
What's beneath the surface of ordinary reality. And once you get below that surface, you're kind of in the mystical.
Right.
So,
below the surface, outside the walls of ordinary perception, something beyond the ordinary.
Right.
Hard to talk about, but many people, if you go around and you ask people if they've ever had an experience like that, you'd be surprised how many people will say, oh, sure, I had that experience when my dog died or when my mom died or when whatever happened. So these are not uncommon experiences, but they feel a lot different from ordinary consciousness.
They're not uncommon by any means, but I would say that for most people, they are not regular either experiences.
Right.
They tend to not, I mean, profoundly mystical experiences don't tend to happen on the regular.
Unless the person is a so-called mystic, someone who has these experiences often, which is not common.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, we got that out of the way.
We got that out of the way.
So having spontaneous mystical experiences is one thing, and then deliberately going and taking a psychedelic compound in a particular context is a different thing, right? I think that's one of the opportunities of psychedelics is that we're actually intentionally choosing to create a situation where you may not have one, but you may have a mystical experience.
That's right. Let me start with a story.
Okay.
How's that sound? We're gonna jump around here. We're gonna jump around here a little bit then, but I think starting with a story is cool. My first LSD experience. I haven't done LSD that many times in my life. My first LSD experience, I think I was 18, sometime around then. And so that was my first psychedelic experience, was actually LSD. And I was with a friend in college. We both did LSD and we're hanging out. And there was a lot of hallucinations going on, like, heavy trails, and it was a wild ride there. And we're both sitting there and we're just kind of went quiet. And there was a roll of aluminum foil on the floor because I was a messy college student. Of course.
Was this in the dorm room or where was
dorm
this?
room? Okay. Dorm room. And I didn't clean up my aluminum foil roll. So it's just sitting right in the open there. And we're just staring at it. And then all of a sudden, it turns into an accordion, like a worm, and it leaves the room. And we're looking at each other, and we know we're both seeing the same thing. And at the same time, we go, that thing just turned into a worm. Just left the room. We both said it at the same time.
You both said that. Okay.
At the same time. And then I picked it up. And we were both like, oh, shit. Why'd you pick it up? That was cool. Because it ended the whole thing. Now, I want to talk about this as a mystical experience for a moment. We both had the exact same hallucination, a very specific, vivid hallucination at the exact same moment. For me, that turned into a very mystical opening in my life.
How so? What were you?
Well, I was like, okay, clearly the chances of that randomly, that we both had the exact same hallucination in the same moment, just sort of randomly happening, is very unlikely. So since that's very unlikely, I went into a very big opening of, okay, our minds actually interface in ways we can't see, in planes that we can't see, in places we can't see. Somehow there's an interaction going on. And that became a very mystical opening for me, of like, there must be a whole way in which we exist that we don't know about. So that was a big moment for me of like, I thought what I saw was reality. Now, I don't think that, tinfoil rolls are turning into worms. I didn't go there. Like, I wasn't in some like fantasy of like, oh, that's really how the world works, or that's not where I went with it. It was more like, oh, our minds actually are entangled in ways that we can't see. That's where I went. And that was a mystical experience for me, of being like, we just got entangled somehow.
So it sounds like you went beyond the ordinary perception, which, we could call it materialism, maybe, of if you see it, you can measure it, then it's real. If you can't see it, you can't measure it, it's not real. You had an experience that for you felt like a set of experiences that couldn't be explained through ordinary frameworks of understanding.
Yeah, rational scientific frameworks. Right. Science is not going to explain that to me. Now, I think it's possible that quantum physics might explain that on some level, in terms of some type of entanglements that happen there. But science doesn't really explain that. So yeah, I went to a place of like, I can't explain this. And so there's more that meets the eye here going on.
Right.
And that became a mystical opening for me.
I think that what you're talking about is a similar quality of awe, and kind of like having your your structures of interpretation and understanding completely blown out of the water that we see in psychedelic therapy. And I could talk more about that later, but it has a similar vibe of like, whoa, there's more to meet the eye here, more than meets the eye.
Totally. Yeah. So it might be fun just for a moment to be like, well, what happened there?
Mm-hmm.
What do we think happened there? Let's just assume that I'm remembering it accurately and we didn't say anything out loud until the moment we did at the same time. And let's just assume we actually both had the hallucination at the same time. If we would just play with that possibility that that's actually what happened, what do we think happened there? How did that happen? What do you think happened? If that actually happened, it wasn't suggestion, it wasn't, what do you think happened if that happened?
This you could call this skepticism or not. I don't know if it's a skeptic in me or not, but where I go with that is every nervous system apparatus, every human individual perceives things in a very unique way. And so even the notion that there could ever be a perception in one person that's exactly the same as another person, even if you and your friend both said it's exactly the same, I don't believe that it could ever be exactly the same in two different individuals because of all the different, variables, nuances. The description of the tinfoil worked like a worm and left the room could be the same description, but the experience itself of any human internal experience is ineffable. It's unique, right? It's like the words point toward an experience, but they're not the experience itself. So that's where I go with that.
Right. Now that's fine, but how do you explain seeing a box turn into a worm at the same moment? Why that box? Why are we hallucinating on the same object in the same moment with roughly a similar description? What's the explanation for you?
Well, you are both having a lot of perceptual experiences in that moment, the two of you. And when I've had experiences on psychedelics where I point to a thing like, do you notice that the walls are moving or the walls are breathing? It's not uncommon for another person to go look at that and say, yeah, I see that too. But I don't assume that they're seeing the same thing I'm seeing.
Yeah.
And that's different from what you're talking about. But I think that when people are having a lot of perceptual disturbances and one person says something, hey, look at that, or do you see that? I don't think it's super uncommon in a, one of the states on a psychedelic that's a feature of it is the suggestibility on the psychedelic. For instance, it's sort of like what I'm trying to describe is, like an Escher painting, right? Where there's like a staircase and it's sort of like inside of itself and it's really hard to tell what's going on there, or some other test of a trick of the mind that you show. Do you see a face in that picture, Keith? No, I don't see it. No, really look, Keith, do you see it? Yeah. Oh, now I see it. Now I see it. Or doesn't that cloud look like a spaceship? No.
Yeah.
Well, really look. Yeah. Okay. Now I can see it.
Yeah.
So I think that there's an openness and a flexibility and like a receptivity to seeing patterns that we don't ordinarily see that is happening simultaneously for you and your friends. So I don't know. I'm not trying to debunk your mystical experience and say it's not mystical, but I think there's a lot going on in a shared psychedelic experience.
Yeah. I have a different sense of what happened there, which is that I think it was a synchronicity of sorts. It's sort of like when someone says something to you and you were thinking it right before they said it. And like it was like so random and out of the blue that you were thinking this one thing and your partner says this thing and it's like about something that happened 10 years ago, whatever. Like I was just thinking that. To me, it feels like it's more in that category that there's some way in which we don't fully understand yet that our social emotional nervous systems actually exchange information on subtle levels that we don't understand.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too.
I go there with this experience. And I think that if that does exist, which it does, obviously our social emotional nervous systems exchange in ways we don't understand. I mean, that seems obvious. But I think that when we begin to touch into those ways, it's a very mystical thing. When we can really touch into the ways we're exchanging in the ways that we can't see, hear, smell, or taste, or touch. And we start exchanging outside of those five senses.
Mhm. If a mystical experience we have on, let's say, January 1st, we come to find out on February 1st that there's a science to, let's say, mirror neurons, right? So maybe we find out that there's a way that the social emotional nervous system does track and respond, and we can see EEG waves happening in the
Yeah.
prefrontal cortex. Does that make it not be a mystical experience at that point?
No, I don't think so. I think then we're starting to merge science with the mystical. I mean, again, what is the mystical? I think it's when we're able to touch into subtler realities that break apart the confines of what we've created in our minds about how the world works and what we see. And when we can go into a wider reality than what we know, a much wider reality, one that maybe is limitless in some way. I think science is going to show and lead us there over time, actually, and already is.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Quantum entanglements and so
Mhm.
many things that break down.
Yeah,
Mhm.
totally. Let's go to another story
Okay.
that you were part of.
Yeah.
We were in an ayahuasca ceremony together
Yeah.
a long time ago.
More than 10 years ago.
Yeah, when we actually did that sort of thing.
That's right.
Um, and I was bouncing around the room, right? I was bouncing up and down.
You were levitating, basically.
Levitating. I was levitating. Yes, levitation exists. um, I was levitating, shaking, right, for a
Yeah.
long time, just like, and the interpretation of the facilitator later was you had a Kundalini rising. That's what that was. I mean, you saw it. I was,
You were
whatever,
shaking. Yeah.
shaking like crazy, bouncing around. And of course, it was an inner experience that was whatever, hard to describe. And the facilitator was like, I've seen this 3 times, and it's definitely a Kundalini rising experience. That's what happened to you. Let's play with that for a little bit.
Maybe you could talk to us about, since you're a ex-yogi, or maybe is there such a thing as an ex-yogi? Or are you always
I'm
a
an
yogi?
No, I'm an ex-yogi. Once a
What,
yogi,
what is
always
it?
a yogi?
Yeah.
No,
No?
unfortunately, it's
Okay.
kind of like
When do they take your card away? Does it have like a couple years you get at a time, or
yeah, I lost my
how's that work?
certification. I gotta go. I gotta go take some CE. I lost my certification. I don't know.
What does
Yeah.
the word Kundalini mean for the folks in the audience who never heard that word before?
Well, Kundalini is used, I think, in a number of ways in yoga and sort of new age. But Kundalini is an energy that sits dormant from Indian mysticism. It's an energy that sits dormant at the bottom of the spine, and it can rise in you, and it's your creative life force, really,
Okay.
through the channels. And so they talk about a Kundalini rising, Kundalini arousal, and it moves through the chakra system. And as it moves through the chakra system, it can cleanse the areas through the chakra system. And then there's this whole thing of like, well, you could have a Kundalini emergency and it just rises spontaneously, which is like what one of the hallmarks of spiritual emergencies, that term. It doesn't have to. You can do practices that slowly cultivate Kundalini energy over time. And I was in a Kundalini yoga tradition. Well, I wasn't in the type of Kundalini yoga most people know, but I was in one of the few lineages that actually is a Kundalini like Shaktipat tradition where they do transmissions and the Kundalini rises. And I was in one of those traditions.
Okay.
Not when we were hanging out together with the ceremony, but yes. So Kundalini. And, when it rises, you can have all kinds of experiences, mystical experiences, oneness, visions, psychic experiences, all kinds of stuff.
Would it be like having some kind of like electrical surge coming into your system? Is that
That's what it feels like. If it
uh
exists, let me just say that, then that's what it feels like. I mean,
Okay.
that's what it felt like for me, if that's what was happening. It's like sticking your finger in a AC outlet.
Wow. Did I tell you
And,
about the
you
time I
know,
did that as a kid?
well,
That's
did I
another
tell you
story for
about the
another
time I
time.
did that as a kid?
Maybe we did it at exactly the same time.
As a kid, there I went through a little phase with my friend where we would take an extension cord and a plug and put it together just enough so you could touch the metal inside, and we would
Oh,
shock
I was
ourselves.
sticking forks in the wall
Oh,
in the outlet.
wow. Okay, you might have burned down your house like that.
Right. Anyway,
Anyways, that's
let's get
another
back to the
story.
topic at hand here.
Yeah, we're
So,
talking about our crazy childhood. So Kundalini energy, though, why this is important is you will hear in psychedelic circles about Kundalini a lot. People will talk about, oh, I had a Kundalini rising, or you might hear a facilitator. Again, not typically like a traditional like shaman or something. Don't usually have that language, but you might hear a facilitator that's broached different worlds use this terminology for some people.
well, let's take a moment to explore this spiritual emergency thing for just a minute, because I think I want to see if we have the same understanding of that. My understanding is that when a person has trauma, they have some of their life force is tied up in some kind of internal entanglement, some kind of internal process that I think of as just like potential energy. I think of it as like really condensed, dense energy that is not available for the person to deploy toward what they want to, how they want to live their life. And so I think about a spiritual emergency as a condition where somehow the density of that place of energy in the body is cracked open. And now it's a relatively violent, kind of sudden experience of going from a status quo to having a really different experience of energy in the body that is hard to integrate and can take a lot of effort, a lot of support to sort of weave back into the being of the person. Is that how you think about spiritual emergency?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think that could be a description of a type of, if someone came to me and that was their description of what was happening to them, I might be like, that sounds like you're having a spiritual emergency. But I don't think it's the only type. For instance, our friend Joan Bersinko talks about her spiritual emergency as a young child when she started hearing voices.
Right.
Um, and, she was starting to go to, they'd taken her to whatever, or it was psychiatrist or whatever, and they thought she was going psychotic. And then she did this thing where she started praying and
Hmm.
they completely went away or
Yeah.
something. And so, like, I would say that's also a spiritual emergency, right? Now, maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it's some kind of locked up energy. Who knows? That's kind of cracking. So I think there's different types of spiritual emergencies for sure. I think there's also like people could have a spiritual crisis, like where their
Hmm.
foundation of how they understood divinity just crumbled in front of them. Like, let's say they had a journey and their whole spiritual identity of the world and how it works just like crumbled, and they can actually go into like a major crisis.
Well, that can
Um,
also happen when we lose a loved one
sure.
in an accident or
Mhm.
an act of violence or something like that. That
Right.
the theme of like whatever you call God, how could God do this to me? How could this happen to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, existential crisis.
Right. Now, coming back to Kundalini, again, this is how I was taught early on. We could decide whether or not I believe in this or not. I don't know. But, I was taught that you can have a Kundalini rising either spontaneously, which is rare, or you do practices that cause it and you're not ready for it. And you can be in a spiritual emergency from that. You can do
Hmm.
some practices where you haven't gotten your body, your nervous system, your spiritual system ready. And you're doing these things that cause Kundalini to rise, and you're not ready. And now you're in a spiritual emergency because you're dealing with too much energy, too much life force. And now that's a whole point of view, which I think there's something there just from my own personal experience. There's
Yeah,
something here.
I think the quality of emergency in my mind has to include the dynamic of not having enough capacity or resilience or structure inside of yourself to hold your experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And whatever the cause of that is and how we frame that. And this can happen on psychedelics, right? I mean, this is whether you
Oh,
call it
sure.
Kundalini or anything, like you can have an experience that you're not that overwhelm your system. Let's say the protection around the wire wasn't thick enough and like it's starting to leak energy out, right?
I just had one of those synchronicities where I was thinking about the insulation on the wire, and there you go.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, you don't believe in that. You tried to debunk that. So it's not true, whatever you're thinking here. It's not a synchronicity. It doesn't exist. Um, yeah, you had one. So yeah, that happens. And mystical experiences can do that to us. Whether it's a rush of energy, that's Kundalini or whatever it is, or let's actually take this into another place, like entities. You know, you go into ceremony in a lot of in other places in the world also, like, and they may be talking about entities,
In the
right?
Amazon, or some
Yeah.
kind of
When
traditional.
I was down there, they were talking about entities. You know, they're doing clearings to keep the space clear of things getting in and negative energies, entities intruding the space.
Right.
Did you ever have an experience of an entity?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think what we're talking about is a framework of shamanic healing where entities and, just energies that are not benevolent or that don't have our best interest in mind are considered to be a part of what you're dealing with all
So
day,
what
every
do you
day.
think about that? What do you make
Well,
of it?
I remember one time I was in the jungle and I was sitting with my teacher, and there was so it was an ayahuasca ceremony. I was deep in the journey. And so the visual imagery was becoming strong. And I started to notice a feeling of dread in my body. And I was sitting in meditation in a circle with my eyes closed. And I was seeing this thing coming toward me that was I couldn't tell if it was an insect or like a helicopter or that kind of like weird mechanical insect shape coming toward me. And it had this feeling, the feeling that came up in my consciousness was it's going to do something to me. And
Hmm.
the facilitators had explained that, you're responsible for your own experience, but if you need help, raise your hand or say the word help if it's pitch black dark. So raising your hand sometimes doesn't do anything. So I said the word help, and one of the helpers came over and she leaned in close to my ear and said, "What do you need?" And I said, "There's a thing coming toward me." And she said, "Is it friendly or not?" And I said, "It's not friendly." And she said, "Don't let it." And then she left and went back to the front of the circle.
Oh, yeah. Good luck.
And it was really powerful that she didn't rescue me, because
Right.
I started to notice this kind of warrior energy arising in me to um, take care of something, myself, my space, that felt worthy of protection, and this archetype, if you will, this facet of my personality came forward, and I slashed and destroyed this thing that was coming at me, and it kind of vaporized and disappeared. And I had this really strong feeling of like, wow, I did it, I took care of it.
And
It was a
did
powerful
you ever
experience.
place meaning on that there is a dimension where energies exist that are actually outside of our body? Or did you place meaning on that like that, well, that's just a part of myself inside my own
That's a great
like
question. I
consciousness?
mean, this is sort of where shamanic healing and Western psychology seem to have a different point of view, right?
They
In West,
definitely do.
I mean, the tendency in Western psychology is like that is a part of you,
Yeah,
right? Especially transpersonal psychology.
that's true.
So
You were also steeped in Buddhism. Would Buddhism say that was a part of your own projection?
that's a great question. Well, I came from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition I was in for many, many, many years, had emerged. It was informed by an older tradition in Tibet called the Bon tradition, Bon. And the Bon tradition was a shamanic tradition that was older than Buddhism in Tibet. And there were entities in the Bon tradition. And so in the tradition I was studying in Buddhism, there were kind of, you could say, dark and light deities that were a part of what we learned about and studied. So it wasn't so clear in the Buddhist tradition I was in. I think in a different tradition, like a Zen tradition, probably there would not be a lot of room for saying, "Oh, there's an entity over there." But
Right. So
Tibetan Buddhism
what's your sense from your own experience of it?
When I think about reality, ordinary and non-ordinary, I think it's a both and for me. I don't think it's an either or. In other words, if you look at microbes, for example, on the micro level, you've got bacteria and amoebas and different things that can coexist and have a symbiotic relationship with each other, right? And you can see this on the macro level in nature, where you've got like aspen trees and you've got certain groups of microbes in the soil that cooperate and so on. But there's also a lot of competition, right? And there's genocides that occur in nature, not just humans, but also with plants and animals and so on. So I think that if we live in a world on the perceptual kind of physical materialist level, we can measure it, we can see it, whatever, where we have, you could say, good and evil going on. There's a fight between this and that. Why wouldn't that be the case on every level of every dimension? Why wouldn't we have, if humans ever become interplanetary, why wouldn't there just be bigger wars between bigger groups of people with more power and more destruction? So I think that, to me, it makes more sense that, if so to speak, good and bad, evil and good happen on this level, they happen in other dimensions. But I also believe simultaneously that all of those labels are labels generated out of ego. What's good, what's bad? I mean, that's, violence occurs by one entity or group on another one. Is it good or bad? I don't know for sure. It's a value judgment. So I think they're both there. That's my synopsis.
Yeah.
You think is it all mind for you?
No. I would say the first thing is it's all I don't know. But the second thing I'll say, and anyone that claims they absolutely know probably don't know themselves that well, because claiming absolutes and things that we have internal experiences of is it's a claim from an individual person. But what I will say that I think I know for sure is that one thing I see is that we can't see everything yet in terms of using scientific instruments. We know that.
Right.
We know there's so much we can't see. And so our understanding of the nature of reality is still pretty young. I mean, we're not that old as a species when we actually started even collecting information and thinking about this stuff. We're super young as a species. So we're babies as a species. So we don't know a lot. So what I would say is I don't know, but my guess is there are definitely sort of dimensions of reality that we definitely do not see, whether some type of energies, whether it's matter or not, collect there. I think that's probably happening. So I'd say it's probably both and, like on some absolute level, I think when we enter unity consciousness, all this goes away anyways. So we're perceiving things, through our mind in relative reality, and we're making sense of them, and we're creating ideas and stories and all of that. So, and we're projecting onto them and creating meaning onto these things, and so I think it's both and.
Yeah. Well, that's good that we're on the same page.
We're on the same page. I mean, I've had enough experience. Here's another story. Go ahead.
Okay, before you go to the next story, I just want to add one caveat here, is that I just want to say, as a therapist, as a healer, I, generally speaking, want people to start with the assumption that it is a part of them, rather than thinking that it's something outside of them. And here's why, is that we have such a huge tendency in human nature to blame our environment or our parents or whatever, our lot in life, the Republicans, whoever the enemy is for the situation we're in, rather than taking responsibility and saying, okay, this is up to me. So I think it's a much more empowering stance oftentimes to take, to just start from the assumption that this is you and this isn't something outside of you. But I don't think that's always the case.
Well, one thing we could say is your reaction is definitely you.
Yeah. Yeah.
We know that. So, whatever's happening out there, which we don't
Yeah.
know when we get into this whole entities or other dimensions, one thing we know is the way we're reacting is you. And so you can work with that.
Absolutely.
And
100%.
the meaning you create on it is you.
Right.
You're the one creating the meaning. Now, somebody might have told you that meaning and you said, okay, I believe that, but you're creating the meaning. So that's you.
And you're responsible for that meaning.
So you better create meaning that helps you and doesn't hurt you.
As our friend Greg Olson would often say.
Yes. You're going to create a story, create a good one.
Exactly.
That's right. So the story for me is that, so when I was in my 20s, I had horrible nightmares all night for all of my 20s, every night without fail, of entities attacking me. And I couldn't breathe. They were like sitting on my chest, dark energy. So in my 20s, I brought this to my guru at the time. This is the Kundalini lineage thing. I was like, what is this? Like, is this a real thing? Like, what do I do? Now, he was smooth on this piece. And he said, he was smooth. And he just said, just trust what's happening and let it pass.
Mm-hmm.
Trust it and let it pass. That's all I said. So that was interesting. But here's the story with what I ended up happening with this. It actually wasn't until ayahuasca that this stopped, which is also interesting.
Wow. Weird.
Yeah. So this experience went on into my 30s. And I haven't done ayahuasca since my 30s, late 30s. So in my ayahuasca journeys, I would sometimes face these same energies that I was waking up from. And what has started happening in my ayahuasca journey spontaneously was I started like moving like a cat and howling and hissing and growling at this energy, particularly on the ones when I was outside in nature. They didn't like that inside the temples. And so I would just start spontaneously doing that. And then during that time period, I would wake up in these nightmares, in the nightmare, attacking the energy from this animal place. And I would scare the shit out of my wife because I would be like in my sleep doing this and like with claws with my hands. Now, this went on for like a few months and then they stopped forever. I don't even think I've had one since that time.
Wow.
What is that? I don't know. But maybe it was entities. So that's a cool story, but let's actually move this into another part of the conversation, which is synchronicity, which I think is really interesting. And also the whole concept of animal spirits and plant spirits. So related to that, one of these nights, I particularly got in touch with the jaguar spirit on the medicine. And I was, I was in a church setting in Colorado. And with a church that came here, a Colombian, church. And I had a deep communion with the jaguar spirit. So I go home that night, and at 7 a.m., I get a knock on my door, and it's a guy who's holding in his hand a big picture of a jaguar face. And he says to me, this jaguar, we just rescued this jaguar from somewhere in South America. There's something going on. And we need money to help this jaguar. It's at the sanctuary right now. Would you give money to support this jaguar? Um, and I was like, well, I'm giving money to support this Jaguar. Um, so, uh, you know, this is where I'm like, okay, you could just say it was random. Um, Synchronicity, but also like this whole concept of, that the animal energy, the plant spirit energy is Jaguar, like that sometimes is talked about with ayahuasca, and
Right.
that there's something there. And I'm like, well, there's something there. I don't know what the hell it is, but something happened there. Right. Like I have enough of these experiences to check off in my life where I'm just like, I don't like to make big conclusions because, I have a propensity to do that. So, and
Yeah.
I get into messes, and like, I could get mentally ill. You don't want to do that when you have like susceptibility with mental illness. So like, you got to be careful with making conclusions, but there's
Mhm.
enough of these check marks in my life to go, there are things going on and dimensions going on that this stuff might be going on in some weird way. What's going on here?
Hmm. Right. I mean, I think it's an important. There's actually been studies on the health benefits of the experience of awe. You know, and I think
Yeah, there's been a lot of studies on that.
and I think it's important to link that up here because when we have experiences that kind of blow our mind and cause us to wonder if the way reality works is really how it works, or is it just a very limited imagination that we have, we can go straight into awe. And I think it's a hallmark of the mystical experience, right?
Hmm.
Is some sort of sense that, oh, there's a much bigger picture here. It's very
Hmm.
beautiful, very beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about the dark side of these experiences that are not euphoric, not pleasurable, not fun, because the melting away of the boundary between our sense of self and our sense of other, or our sense of nature, or sense of the universe, can be incredibly fulfilling and peaceful, beautiful,
Inspiring,
yeah,
awe-inspiring,
awe-inspiring,
uh,
life-changing.
life-changing. That's one way it goes.
Can go that way. There can also be an incredible amount of terror and annihilatory panic.
Terror, panic, confusion, agitation,
Yeah. Disorientation,
disorientation.
loss of reference points,
Hmm.
really even loss of like circadian rhythms, loss of
Hmm.
ups and downs,
Mania. You can
meaning.
get
Yeah.
you can get
Mania.
like sort of, inflated. Yeah.
Yeah. I had an experience. Maybe it's time for me to share a story here where I was getting trained in ketamine therapy. And this was 7 or 8 years ago. And I went to a ketamine training where the facilitator suggested a range of ketamine, intramuscular ketamine. And I tend to have a propensity to go big in my life, try to do things that sometimes are a little over my head. And this particular facilitator didn't dictate the dose. He said, it's up to you, but here's the range. So I did a big dose of ketamine on day one, and then a second big dose of ketamine on day two. And we left the retreat, I think it was later that afternoon on day two. So there wasn't really any time for integration. And on the way out of the retreat, I was deeply fragmented. I was having all kinds of uncomfortable physical experiences, nausea, disorientation, dizziness, tinnitus. And I had to get on a flight to go to a conference to function professionally. I was about to get on the plane. Luckily, I was with a couple of people who were with me in the ketamine training and getting on the flight with me. So I had friends, which helped a lot. But I told my friends in the airport, man, everything is too intense. The lights above me are really scary. I don't think I can get on this flight. And they said, well, if we're with you, can you get on the flight? And I get on the flight with them. We got out of the airport and we were in an Uber. And I remember I was sitting in the back seat between my two friends, and I started having intrusive thoughts to jump out of the Uber on the highway. It's going about 60 miles an hour, multi-lane highway. I never had these
Hmm.
experiences before. It was not part of my
Right.
repertoire. The long story short is it took me a few weeks to feel like I was in my ordinary self again. I don't know if I'd ever say that I was back to who I was before, because this experience changed me permanently. I think ultimately for the better, in the sense that it opened me up to a lot of things, the fragility of my mind, the density of my belief systems, and so forth. But it took a while to integrate that experience. And I think these fragmenting experiences are scary and difficult to go through. Take a lot of support to move through effectively.
And yes, been through many of them, and they are mystical, even though they are incredibly painful. They do have a mystical quality, as when your ego sort of falls apart, your reference is completely gone.
Hmm.
And so there's a mystical quality of you are getting beyond yourself in some way, but it's a shattering. It's not the funnest way, because there's my experience with ego fragmentation, if that's what we're calling this, and from people I've worked with, is that there's sort of you're sort of in between worlds
Yeah.
of you're sort of feeling beyond the ego, but your ego is sort of trying to keep itself together and fighting for its solidarity. Is that the right? No, falling for its solidness, right? It's
Integrity. Yeah.
integrity and form,
Right.
um, and um, and that's terrifying, right? And everything's chaotic, and it's not the brain's firing in all kinds of weird directions, and so you get all these intrusive thoughts, and um, your inhibited brain is like not functioning properly. It's like you're getting all this stuff from probably your brainstem
Hmm.
shooting up, and yeah, it's pretty intense. And I agree with you. For myself, it these things have led to a much broader way of being in the world, a wider way, a more humble, a more open way. But I don't think I'm ever the same after those experiences, and I don't wish those upon myself or anyone. Honestly,
Yeah.
they're very intense, and it's one thing that can happen.
It's one of our spiritual teachers had a line that goes, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that enlightenment is one humiliation after another, is what he would say. And he was speaking about, of course, the ego's point of view.
Mhm.
But it is incredibly humbling to go through those experiences. And certainly we can wish for gentle humblings, but they're not all gentle.
No,
Yeah.
and you got to wonder how trauma plays into these experiences. Fragmentation, right? Like
Right.
obviously with trauma, it's easy for significant trauma to lead to some experience of fragmentation. So we can fragment away from the reality that we're seeing,
Right.
right? So we don't have to
Yeah.
take it in as a whole. We could take it in parts,
Right.
receive
But
parts of our reality, but not all of our reality. And that is uncomfortable when that's forced on us.
right. When we're forced to see that for the exact being able to perceive that in sort of accelerated time, right? Where
Mm,
we're actually aware that there's fragmentation, but there's nothing we can do about it in the moment.
yeah,
Really
yeah,
scary. Yeah. Uncomfortable.
yeah. And I think there is a piece of, I mean, you again, like if you took a Western psychology lens here, you might argue that that's the ego defense mechanism from an overwhelming experience, right? You might argue
To
it
go into
more of like,
fragmentation.
yeah, like more of like a dissociation
Hmm.
spectrum almost. You might argue that it's the ego's mechanism so that it doesn't, get obliterated or go psychotic. It fragments.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that would be one argument, but I think there's also something here mystically. It opens, like you're saying. Like I think it's common for people who put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Hopefully,
Mostly.
mostly you might be missing a little shell walking around with like a black hole.
Right.
Actually, you probably are.
Yeah.
So Humpty Dumpty's not all the way back together again, but um,
Maybe
but
Humpty
then
has a softer shell after he gets put back
Humpty has
together.
a shell, softer shell, little holes here and there.
Maybe
Yeah,
not as so brittle in your perception of how reality works.
yeah, or so hard.
That too.
All right. Yeah. So it's all valid and useful and interesting to sort of think about what is this stuff and what's real and what's not real. And I think some of us think we're real. So maybe we're real. Um,
Well, it's part of the story. We're real and
yeah,
we're not real.
we're real and we're not real. Um, but maybe we should start wrapping up here that we're real, we're not real. And
Yeah, I guess I also want to just speak to the listener who might be in the middle of one of these experiences we were just talking about,
that's true.
and say, look,
Yeah.
there's help available.
Yeah, there's support.
Yeah, yeah,
and it all leads to growth as soon as you can get on that path.
yeah.
Yeah.
Post-traumatic growth is real, and one of the benefits I had in that moment of pain was I was on my way to a MAPS conference, and so when I started to talk to a handful of people, I was a little scared to share my experience, but when I opened up and spoke to people, there were lots of people there who had very fragmenting, difficult experiences and come back from it. And sharing those stories with me helped me feel more confident that, I hadn't broken myself permanently and I would find my way, which of course I did. So yeah, know that people come back from these fragmenting experiences.
Yeah. All right.